Hook. In the grand corridors of Ashford Palace, where centuries of secrets lay buried beneath marble floors and golden tapestries, Princess Elena Victoria discovered that her entire life had been built on a lie. The revelation came not through whispered gossip or stolen letters, but through a simple DNA test that would shake the very foundations of the Ashford dynasty. The morning began like any other in the royal household. Princess Elena, 28, and known for her charitable work and modern approach to monarchy, sat in her private study, overlooking the palace gardens. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patterns across the mahogany desk where she reviewed correspondence from various humanitarian organizations. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore a simple cream blouse rather than the formal attire expected of royalty during public appearances. Elena had always been different from her older brother, Crown Prince Alexander. Where he was tall and broad-shouldered, with the distinctive Ashford dark hair and piercing blue eyes, she was petite, with warm brown eyes and features that seemed to belong to a different family entirely. Palace staff had always attributed this to her taking after their late grandmother, Queen Margaret, but Elena had never seen the resemblance that others claimed to notice. The knock on her door interrupted her thoughts about the upcoming charity gala she was organizing for underprivileged children. Her personal secretary, James Morrison, entered with his usual formal demeanor, but something in his expression made Elena look up from her papers with concern.
Your Royal Highness, there's a visitor requesting an immediate audience with you.
She claims to have information of the utmost importance regarding your family. James's voice carried an unusual tension that Elena had rarely heard in their 5 years of working together. Elena frowned, setting down her fountain pen. What kind of information? You know my schedule today is completely booked with the gala preparations. Ma'am, she specifically mentioned that it concerns your biological parentage. She has documentation with her. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Biological parentage. The phrase seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. Elena had occasionally wondered about her different appearance, but the thought that she might not be King Frederick and Queen Isabella's biological daughter had never seriously crossed her mind. Send her in, Elena said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. The woman who entered was approximately 60 years old, with greying hair pulled back in a neat bun and clothes that suggested middle-class comfort rather than wealth. She carried a worn leather briefcase and moved with the careful dignity of someone who had spent years working in service. Your Royal Highness, my name is Margaret Thornfield. I was a nurse at St. Gall, Catherine's Hospital 28 years ago. The woman's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. I was present at your birth, and I've carried a terrible secret all these years. Elena gestured for Margaret to sit in one of the chairs facing her desk. Please, tell me what you believe I need to know.
Margaret opened her briefcase with shaking hands and withdrew several manila folders.
Your Royal Highness, on the night you were born there was a terrible storm. The hospital was understaffed, and there were complications with multiple births that evening. 2 babies were born within minutes of each other in adjacent rooms. Elena felt her heart beginning to race, but she maintained her composure. Years of royal training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, even as her world seemed to be shifting beneath her feet. 1 baby was born to their Majesties, King Frederick and Queen Isabella. Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. The other was born to a young woman named Catherine Mills, who was unmarried and had been abandoned by her family when they discovered her pregnancy. The room seemed to grow colder as Elena processed the implications of what Margaret was saying. Are you suggesting that there was some kind of mix-up? Margaret nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. The storm caused a power outage just as both babies were being cleaned and tagged. In the darkness and confusion, with multiple staff members rushing between rooms, the identification bracelets were switched. I realized what had happened the next morning when I compared the babies more carefully, but by then, the royal family had already announced your birth to the world. Elena's hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. And you said nothing? I was young and terrified, Margaret said, her voice breaking. Doctor Harrison, the senior physician, told me that revealing the mistake would cause a constitutional crisis. He said it would be better for everyone if we remained silent. The other baby, the one who was actually your biological parent's child, had already been taken by Catherine Mills. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours rather than minutes. Elena stared at the documents Margaret had placed on her desk without really seeing them. Everything she had ever known about herself, her identity, her place in the world, was being called into question by this elderly woman who claimed to have knowledge of events from nearly 3 decades ago. Where is Catherine Mills now? Elena asked finally. She died in a car accident when the child was 15, Margaret replied softly. The child, a girl named Sarah, was raised by Catherine's sister in a small town called Millbrook, about 200 miles from here. Elena's mind raced with questions and implications. If what Margaret was saying was true, then she was not the biological daughter of the king and queen. She was not truly a princess. Her entire life, her education, her role in the monarchy, her planned future as a working member of the royal family, was all based on a hospital error made during a storm nearly 30 years ago.
More importantly, there was another young woman out there who was the actual biological daughter of the king and queen, living an ordinary life without knowing her true parentage.
Do you have any proof of these claims? Elena asked, though part of her already knew that Margaret wouldn't have come forward without substantial evidence.
Margaret reached into her briefcase again and withdrew a sealed envelope. I kept tissue samples from both babies that night. DNA technology wasn't available then, but I knew that someday it might be possible to prove the truth. I've had the samples tested by 3 different laboratories over the past 6 months.
The results are identical in all cases.
Elena took the envelope with trembling hands but didn't open it immediately.
Why are you coming forward now? Why not years ago? Harrison died 6 months ago, Margaret explained. Before he passed, he gave me a letter saying that he regretted pressuring me to keep the secret. He said it was up to me to decide whether to reveal the truth. I've wrestled with this decision every day since then. Margaret paused, studying Elena's face with compassionate eyes. But there's another reason. Sarah Mills, the young woman I believe to be the actual princess, is very ill. She has a rare genetic condition that requires expensive treatment she cannot afford. She's been working 3 jobs trying to pay for her medical care while also supporting her elderly aunt. The irony was not lost on Elena. While she had lived a life of privilege and luxury with access to the finest medical care in the world, the woman who was rightfully entitled to that life was struggling with a serious illness and financial hardship. Elena finally opened the envelope and scanned the DNA test results. The technical language was difficult to understand, but the conclusion was clear. There was no biological relationship between Elena Victoria Ashford and either King Frederick or Queen Isabella. A separate test showed a strong probability of biological relationship between Elena and the tissue sample labeled as belonging to Catherine Mills. What do you expect me to do with this information? Elena asked, though she already knew that she couldn't simply ignore what she had learned. I don't expect anything, Your Royal Highness, Margaret replied. I just felt that you and Sarah both deserve to know the truth. What you choose to do with that truth is entirely up to you. As Margaret prepared to leave, she handed Elena a final piece of paper. This is Sarah's current address and phone number. I haven't contacted her yet. I wanted to speak with you first. After Margaret left, Elena sat alone in her study for hours, staring at the DNA test results and the address of the woman who might be her biological sister. Outside her window, the palace gardens continued their eternal cycle of growth and change. But inside the study, Elena felt as though time had stopped entirely. The implications of what she had learned were staggering. If she revealed the truth, it would create the constitutional crisis that Dr. Harrison had feared decades ago. The legitimacy of the royal succession would be called into question. The media would have a field day with the story. Her parents, King Frederick and Queen Isabella, would be devastated to learn that their beloved daughter was not biologically theirs. But if she remained silent, she would be perpetuating a lie that had already caused tremendous suffering. Sarah Mills was struggling with both illness and poverty, while the life that should have been hers remained beyond her reach. Elena thought about her brother Alexander, who would someday be king. How would this revelation affect him? Would the public lose faith in the monarchy if they learned about the hospital mix-up? Would there be calls for Sarah to be recognized as the legitimate princess? As evening approached, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and dialed the number Margaret had given her. The phone rang 3 times before a tired voice answered.
Hello? Is this Sarah Mills? Yes, who is this?
Elena took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would set in motion a chain of events that could destroy everything she had ever known.
I believe we need to talk about something that happened 28 years ago at St. Catherine's Hospital. Something that involves both of our lives in ways you couldn't possibly imagine. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that Elena wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was cautious and confused. I don't understand. What could something from 28 years ago have to do with me? I wasn't even born until... Sarah stopped speaking abruptly, and Elena could almost hear the realization beginning to form. You were born on March 15th, weren't you? Elena asked gently. At St. Catherine's Hospital during a storm? How do you know that? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper now. Elena closed her eyes, still struggling to believe the words she was about to speak. Because I was born the same night, in the same hospital, and I believe there was a mistake that changed both of our lives. The conversation that followed was awkward and filled with long pauses as Elena tried to explain the situation without overwhelming Sarah with too much information at once. She carefully avoided mentioning her royal identity, introducing herself only as Elena Victoria and suggesting they meet in person to discuss the details. Sarah agreed to meet the following day at a small cafe in Millbrook, the town where she had grown up. Elena spent the night lying awake, staring at the ornate ceiling of a bedroom and wondering how she would explain to Sarah that she was actually a princess, while Elena herself was living a life that rightfully belonged to someone else. The drive to Millbrook the next morning was unlike any journey Elena had ever taken. For the first time in her life, she drove herself without security detail or official protocol. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, clothes that would help her blend in rather than stand out. The freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. Millbrook was exactly the kind of small town Elena had only seen in movies. Main Street was lined with family-owned businesses, and everyone seemed to know everyone else. Elena found the cafe easily and chose a corner table where they could speak privately. Sarah arrived precisely on time, and Elena recognized her immediately despite never having seen her before. It wasn't that they looked alike, exactly, but there was something familiar about Sarah's posture, the way she moved, even the way she glanced around the cafe before approaching Elena's table. Sarah was tall and elegant despite her obviously worn clothes and tired expression. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her blue eyes were the same distinctive shade that Elena had always admired in her father, King Frederick. The resemblance to the royal family was subtle but unmistakable once Elena knew what to look for. "Elena?" Sarah asked tentatively as she approached the table. "Thank you for coming," Elena said, standing to shake Sarah's hand. "I know this must seem very strange." As they sat down and ordered coffee, Elena studied Sarah more carefully. Despite her obvious fatigue, Sarah carried herself with natural grace and dignity. Her clothes were clean and well maintained, but Elena could see the careful mending in her sweater and the worn condition of her shoes. This was someone who took pride in her appearance despite limited resources. "So," Sarah said once their coffee had arrived, "tell me about this hospital mistake you mentioned." Elena had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times during the sleepless night, but she still struggled to find the right words. She decided to start with the basic facts and see how Sarah reacted. "A woman named Margaret Thornfield came to see me yesterday. She was a nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital the night we were born. She believes that 2 babies were accidentally switched during the confusion of a power outage." Sarah's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "Switched how?" "The identification bracelets were mixed up in the darkness. Each baby went home with the wrong family."
Are you saying that I was supposed to go home with your parents instead of with my mother?
Elena nodded, watching Sarah's face carefully for signs of how she was processing this information. Margaret has DNA evidence to support her claim. The silence that followed was heavy with implications.
Sarah stared out the cafe window at the quiet street, her mind clearly racing through the ramifications of what Elena was telling her. "Who are your parents?" Sarah asked finally. This was the moment Elena had been dreading. She took a deep breath and decided that after everything Sarah had been told, she deserved complete honesty. "King Frederick and Queen Isabella of Ashford," Elena said quietly. "I'm Princess Elena Victoria." Sarah's reaction was not what Elena had expected. Instead of shock or disbelief, Sarah began to laugh softly, shaking her head. "Of course you are," Sarah said, but there was no bitterness in her voice, only a kind of resigned amazement. "I should have known. This whole situation is so unbelievable that of course it would involve royalty." Eleanor was surprised by Sarah's composure. "You don't seem as shocked as I thought you would be." "I think I'm in shock," Sarah admitted. But it also explained some things that never made sense. "My mother, Catherine, never talked about my father except to say that he was from a very different world than ours." I always wondered what she meant by that. Sarah paused, studying Elena's face with new interest. "And you really are a princess? Like, with a tiara and everything?" Despite the gravity of the situation, Elena found herself smiling.
I do own several tiaras, yes.
"Though I don't wear them to charity meetings or hospital visits. What's it like?" Sarah asked. Growing up in a palace, I mean. Elena considered the question carefully. It's privileged, obviously. But it's also very structured. Every moment of every day is planned. You're constantly being prepared for your role in public service. You're taught that your personal desires come second to your duty to the country. That sounds lonely, Sarah observed. Sometimes it is, Elena admitted. But I've always believed it was worthwhile because of the good we can do. My charity work, the organizations I support, the awareness we can bring to important causes. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I've seen your work in the news, the children's hospitals, the literacy programs. You do good work. Thank you, Elena said, touched by the sincere compliment. But that brings us to why I wanted to meet with you. Margaret told me about your illness. Sarah's expression immediately became guarded. What about it? She said you've been struggling to afford treatment while working multiple jobs to support yourself and your aunt. I manage, Sarah said defensively. I'm sure you do, Elena replied gently. But you shouldn't have to. If what Margaret says is true, then you should have had access to the best medical care in the world. You should have grown up with every advantage, every opportunity. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, absently stirring her coffee. And what about you? If this is all true, then you've been living my life while I've been living yours. How does that make you feel? Elena had asked herself that same question countless times since Margaret's visit. Guilty, she said honestly, confused. Scared about what happens next. What do you think should happen next? Sarah asked. Elena had been hoping Sarah would have some insight into that question, but it was clear that Sarah was as overwhelmed by the situation as Elena herself was. I don't know, Elena admitted. Part of me thinks we should get independent DNA testing done to confirm Margaret's claims. But part of me is terrified of what we'll do if those tests confirm everything she told us. You're afraid of losing your life as a princess, Sarah said. But it wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Yes, Elena said, but not for the reasons you might think. It's not about the luxury or the privilege, it's about my parents. King Frederick and Queen Isabella raised me and loved me. They're my parents in every way that matters except biologically. The thought of hurting them with this knowledge is almost unbearable. Sarah's expression softened. They sound like good people. They are. They're wonderful people who dedicated their lives to serving our country. This news would devastate them. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying Elena with thoughtful blue eyes. But keeping it secret means I continue living with a chronic illness I can't afford to treat properly, while you continue living the life that might rightfully be mine. The stark truth of Sarah's words hit Elena hard. There was no way around the basic ethical dilemma they faced. What if, Elena said slowly, we could find a way to address your medical needs without necessarily revealing the truth publicly? I have access to resources that could help you, regardless of what we decide about the larger situation. Sarah shook her head firmly. I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept charity from you, especially under these circumstances. It would feel too much like buying my silence. Elena respected Sarah's pride, but she also saw the subtle signs of illness that Sarah was trying to hide. The slight tremor in her hands, the careful way she moved, the fatigue in her eyes despite her attempts to appear strong. What kind of work do you do? Elena asked, changing the subject for the moment. I'm a teacher, Sarah said, and for the first time since they'd started talking, her face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary. I also work part-time at the library and do bookkeeping for a few local businesses. You're working 3 jobs while dealing with a chronic illness. I love teaching, Sarah said simply. The kids make everything worthwhile, and I love books, so the library work doesn't feel like work. The bookkeeping is just practical necessity. Elena was struck by Sarah's quiet dignity and determination. Here was someone who had faced real hardship but had channeled her energy into helping others rather than feeling sorry for herself. Tell me about your students, Elena said. For the next hour, they talked about Sarah's teaching, her students, and the challenges facing the small-town school system. Elena found herself genuinely interested in Sarah's work and impressed by her dedication. Sarah described individual students with the kind of detailed care that spoke to her natural empathy and commitment. As their conversation continued, Elena began to see glimpses of the person Sarah might have become if she had grown up with different opportunities. Her intelligence was obvious, as was her natural leadership ability and her instinctive understanding of how to connect with people. What would you do? Elena asked eventually. If money and circumstances weren't factors, what would be your ideal life? Sarah considered the question seriously. I think I'd want to work in education policy, maybe at the national level. There are so many problems with how we fund schools and support teachers. I see it every day in my classroom. Kids who could achieve amazing things if they just had better resources. Elena felt a chill of recognition. Sarah's answer was exactly the kind of thoughtful, service-oriented response that Elena herself had been trained to give when asked about her goals and aspirations. As the afternoon wore on, both women became increasingly aware of the profound decision they faced. The DNA tests Margaret had provided seemed credible, but they both wanted independent confirmation before making any irreversible choices. I think we need to get our own tests done, Sarah said finally. If we're going to even consider making this public, we need to be absolutely certain of the facts. Elena nodded. I agree. But I think we should also consider what we want the outcome to be before we get results that might force our hand. What do you mean? I mean, do you want to be a princess, Sarah? If the tests confirm everything, do you want to claim your rightful place in the royal family? Because once we start down that path, there's no going back. Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring out at the street where children were walking home from school, their backpacks bouncing as they ran and played. I don't know, she said finally. I never dreamed of being a princess. I dreamed of being a teacher, and I achieved that goal. But I also think about all the good I could do with the platform and resources that come with being a royal. I think about the educational initiatives I could support, the awareness I could bring to issues affecting teachers and students. Elena understood exactly what Sarah meant. The sense of duty and the desire to use privilege for good were clearly ingrained in Sarah's character, just as they had been carefully cultivated in Elena's own upbringing. And what about you? Sarah asked. If the tests confirm everything, would you be willing to give up your title and your royal life? Elena had been dreading that question, but she knew she had to face it honestly. I'm terrified of that possibility, she admitted. But I also know that I couldn't live with myself if I continued living a lie while you suffered because of that lie. As they prepared to leave the cafe, they exchanged contact information and made plans to get independent DNA testing done through separate laboratories. They agreed to meet again once they had results to discuss their next steps. Walking back to her car, Elena felt as though she was moving through a dream. Everything about the day felt surreal, from driving herself to a small-town cafe to having a conversation that could potentially change the course of history for the Ashford monarchy. But what struck her most was how much she had genuinely liked Sarah. Despite the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting, she felt a real connection to this woman who might be her biological sister. Sarah's intelligence, compassion, and quiet strength were exactly the qualities Elena had always hoped to embody in her own royal role. As she drove back toward the palace, Eleanor realized that regardless of what the DNA tests revealed, her life had already changed irrevocably. She could never again take her royal position for granted, knowing that it might rightfully belong to someone else. More importantly, she now knew that there was a remarkable woman out there who was struggling with challenges that Elena's resources could easily solve. The question was no longer whether she should help Sarah, but how she could do so without compromising the integrity of the monarchy or devastating the parents who had raised and loved her as their own daughter. The DNA results arrived exactly 1 week after Elena's meeting with Sarah, delivered to both women simultaneously by overnight courier. Elena received hers while sitting in the same study where Margaret Thornfield had first revealed the truth about their switched identities. The manila envelope sat unopened on her desk for nearly an hour, while she stared at it, knowing that whatever was written on the papers inside would determine the course of the rest of her life. When she finally opened the envelope, the results were unambiguous. The independent laboratory had reached the same conclusion as Margaret's tests. There was no biological relationship between Eleanor and King Frederick or Queen Isabella. A second test confirmed a strong probability that Elena and Catherine Mills were related, making Sarah Mills her biological sister. Elena's hands trembled as she set the papers down and reached for her phone to call Sarah. They had agreed to speak as soon as both had received their results. Elena? Sarah's voice was subdued when she answered. The same as Margaret's tests? Elena asked. Yes, no room for doubt. Sarah paused. Are you okay? Elena considered the question. Was she okay? She felt as though her entire identity had been stripped away, leaving her uncertain about who she really was or where she belonged. At the same time, she felt a strange sense of relief that the truth was finally known. I don't know, Elena answered honestly. How are you handling it? I keep looking around my apartment and thinking that none of this should be my life, Sarah said. I woke up this morning in a one-bedroom flat where the heat doesn't work properly and went to school to teach in a classroom where we don't have enough books for all the students. Meanwhile, you woke up in a palace. The pain in Sarah's voice was unmistakable, and Elena felt the full weight of the injustice that had shaped both their lives. Sarah, we need to talk about what happens next. Can you come to the palace? Are you sure you're ready for that? Elena wasn't sure at all, but she knew they couldn't continue living with this knowledge without taking action. I think it's the only way forward. The conversation with King Frederick and Queen Isabella was the most difficult of Elena's life. She had requested a private meeting with them in the king's study, the same room where countless royal decisions had been made over the centuries. When Elena finished explaining everything Margaret had told her and showed them the DNA test results, the silence was deafening. Queen Isabella, normally composed and graceful, sat with tears streaming down her face. King Frederick stood at the window with his back to Elena, his shoulders rigid with shock. All these years, the Queen said finally, we loved you as our own daughter, and you are our daughter in every way that matters. But somewhere out there, our biological child was struggling while we were raising another woman's daughter. You raised me with love and care, Elena said, fighting back her own tears. You're my parents, regardless of biology. But we have to face the reality of what this means. King Frederick turned from the window, and Elena was shocked to see how much he had aged in the span of their conversation. What does Sarah want? Does she want to claim her rightful place in the succession? She hasn't said, Elena admitted. But I think she deserves the choice. She deserves to know the truth about her parentage, and she deserves to have the medical care and opportunities that should have been hers from birth. Queen Isabella reached for Elena's hand. And what about you, darling? What do you want? Elena had spent sleepless nights trying to answer that question. I want to do what's right. If that means stepping aside so Sarah can take her rightful place, then that's what I'll do. But I also want to make sure that the monarchy survives this transition. The last thing our country needs is a constitutional crisis. King Frederick sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. We'll need to consult with the Prime Minister and the constitutional experts. This situation is unprecedented. Quiet. There's something else, Elena said quietly. Sarah is remarkable. She's intelligent, compassionate, and dedicated to public service. She's been working as a teacher while struggling with a chronic illness, yet she still volunteers in her community and cares deeply about social issues. I think she would be an asset to the royal family. The king and queen exchanged a meaningful look. They had always prided themselves on their ability to judge character, and they trusted Elena's assessment of people. When will we meet her? Queen Isabella asked. She's coming tomorrow afternoon. I thought it would be best to start with an informal meeting before we make any decisions about public announcements. The next day, Elena waited nervously in the palace's most intimate sitting room as Sarah was escorted through the corridors by James Morrison. Elena had chosen this room specifically because it felt more like a family home than a royal residence, with comfortable furniture and family photographs rather than formal portraits. When Sarah entered, Elena was struck again by how naturally regal she appeared, even in her simple dress and cardigan. Sarah moved with unconscious grace, and her posture was perfectly straight despite her obvious nervousness. Your Majesties? Sarah said, offering a respectful curtsy that was technically perfect despite having never been taught royal protocol. King Frederick and Queen Isabella rose to greet her, and Elena watched her parents' faces as they saw Sarah for the first time. The resemblance to the royal bloodline was unmistakable now that they knew to look for it. Sarah had inherited King Frederick's distinctive eyes and Queen Isabella's elegant bone structure. Please, sit with us, Queen Isabella said gently. We have so much to talk about. What followed was one of the most emotional conversations Elena had ever witnessed. Sarah spoke about her childhood with Catherine Mills, describing a loving but financially struggling single mother who had worked multiple jobs to provide for her daughter. She talked about her education, funded by scholarships and part-time work, and her decision to become a teacher despite the financial challenges. King Frederick and Queen Isabella listened with growing admiration and heartbreak. Here was their biological daughter, clearly intelligent and principled, describing a life of hardship that could have been completely avoided, if not for the hospital mistake. Tell us about your illness, Queen Isabella said softly. Sarah explained her condition with clinical detachment, but Elena could see the fear underneath her composed exterior. The treatment she needed was expensive and ongoing, and her current insurance coverage was inadequate. We want to help with your medical care, King Frederick said immediately. Regardless of what we decide about the larger situation, you shouldn't suffer because of a mistake made nearly 30 years ago.
I appreciate the offer, Sarah said carefully, but I need to understand what strings might be attached to that help.
Even in these extraordinary circumstances, she was thinking clearly about the implications of accepting royal assistance.
No strings, Queen Isabella assured her.
But we do need to discuss what happens next. This secret cannot remain private indefinitely. Too many people know the truth now. Over the next several hours, they discussed various options. They could attempt to keep the information private, while quietly ensuring Sarah received proper medical care and opportunities. They could make a gradual transition, introducing Sarah to royal duties while slowly reducing Elena's official role. Or they could make a complete revelation, acknowledging the mistake and formally transferring royal status to Sarah. Each option carried significant risks and benefits. Keeping the secret protected the monarchy from scandal but perpetuated the original injustice. A gradual transition might minimize public disruption but could appear deceptive if discovered. A complete revelation would be honest but potentially damaging to the institution of monarchy. "What do you want, Sarah?" Elena asked finally. "Not what you think you should want, but what you actually want for your life." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking around the elegant room with its priceless artwork and historical significance. "I want to serve," she said eventually. "I became a teacher because I wanted to make a difference in children's lives. If being a princess would allow me to make an even greater difference, then I want to embrace that responsibility. But I don't want to destroy Elena's life or damage the monarchy in the process." King Frederick leaned forward. "What if we could find a way to do both? What if we could acknowledge the truth while also acknowledging that Elena has served admirably in her role?" "What do you mean?" "What if we created a new model?" the king continued. "Royal sisters, both serving the crown in different capacities. Sarah could be formally recognized as our biological daughter and given a place in the succession, while Elena continues the charitable work she's passionate about as an honorary princess." It was an unprecedented suggestion, but as they talked through the details, it began to seem not only possible, but ideal. Sarah could take on the formal duties of a royal heir, including representing the country at state functions and eventually inheriting certain royal responsibilities. Elena could continue her humanitarian work with full royal support, but without the burden of succession duties she had never particularly wanted.
The public would accept this? Sarah asked.
They would if we handled it correctly, Queen Isabella said thoughtfully.
We would need to control the narrative, emphasizing both the tragedy of the original mistake and the remarkable character of both young women involved. Elena's years of service speak for themselves, and your background as a dedicated teacher would resonate with people. Elena felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The prospect of continuing her charitable work without the pressure of eventually becoming queen was deeply appealing. She had always struggled with the formal aspects of royal duty, preferring direct service to ceremonial obligations. "There's something else to consider," Elena said. "If we're going to do this, we should do it in a way that brings attention to important causes. Sarah's illness affects thousands of people who lack access to proper treatment. My education work could be expanded. We could use this situation to highlight issues that matter." Sarah's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "We could create awareness about healthcare access, education funding, the challenges facing working families. Turn this personal story into something that helps other people." King Frederick and Queen Isabella exchanged another meaningful look. This was exactly the kind of thinking that had made them proud of Elena throughout her life, and they could see the same sense of service and social consciousness in Sarah. "We'll need time to plan this carefully," the king said. "We'll need to consult with constitutional experts, prepare public statements, and coordinate with the Prime Minister's office. But I think we may have found a path forward that honors both the truth and our commitment to serving the people." 3 months later, the announcement was made in a carefully orchestrated press conference. King Frederick and Queen Isabella stood flanked by both Elena and Sarah as they revealed the hospital mistake and introduced Sarah as their biological daughter. The public response was overwhelmingly positive, with media coverage focusing on the remarkable grace and dignity both women had shown throughout the revelation. Sarah was formally invested as Princess Sarah Catherine and named second in line to the throne after Prince Alexander. Elena retained her title as Princess Elena Victoria and was appointed as the first director of the Royal Foundation for Education and Healthcare Access. The transition was not without challenges. Sarah had to undergo intensive training in royal protocol and constitutional law while managing her ongoing medical treatment. Elena had to adjust to a new role that was less formal but more focused on the direct service work she had always preferred. But as Elena stood beside Sarah on the palace balcony during Sarah's first official public appearance, watching thousands of people cheer for the woman who had spent most of her life struggling in anonymity, she felt a profound sense of rightness about the path they had chosen. The mistake made during a storm nearly 30 years ago had finally been corrected. But more importantly, it had led to a new model of royal service that both sisters were uniquely qualified to provide. Sarah brought her experience with real-world challenges and her commitment to education, while Elena contributed her years of charitable experience and her understanding of how to use royal influence for social good. In the end, the revelation that had initially threatened to destroy everything had instead created something better than either woman could have achieved alone. The monarchy was stronger, the country had gained two dedicated public servants, and both Elena and Sarah had found their true calling in service to others. As Elena watched Sarah wave to the crowds with the natural grace of someone born to the role, she realized that sometimes the truth, no matter how complicated or painful, was the only path to real justice and genuine happiness.